Hello and welcome to the DCDF podcast. This is episode 3. We've got a whole host of awesome topics to talk about today. We've actually had a good amount of things happen since the last episode. So we're going to try and recap some of those, give our thoughts, talk about all that stuff, all that good stuff you come here for. Our normal start of episode housekeeping things. I'm planning on starting to have some guests come through the podcast probably after episode 4-ish. So I'm starting to line up some guests. If there's any guests you guys want to see on the podcast, drop me some feedback anywhere you can get in touch with me. But we're starting to try and get people involved, some of the more, commonly seen names in the community. We're going to try and get them on here, talk about their stuff, maybe talk about some fun topics. So that should be coming soon. Other than that, format is going to remain the same. Podcast is still being released on the same platforms, YouTube, Spotify Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. So if you guys want to subscribe there, try and listen to those on the go versus listening to it on YouTube, I would suggest checking that out if that is your kind of thing. So without further ado, let's get into it. First topic of the week, we got some huge news on August 4th, being A, we got a surprise patch, but B, more importantly, we got the news that moving forward, we'll be moving into a weekly patch schedule. So I believe it's going to be every Tuesday we will be receiving patches, and we did receive a patch this past Tuesday. We'll talk about that one later. But basically, the developer said they want to patch weekly, and those patches should be including things like bug fixes, balance changes, new content, the new comics, things like that. So that was awesome to see. One of the biggest complaints that I had seen either on Discord or on YouTube or any of the places where I, talk to the community at large, one of the biggest complaints that I had seen was A, not really hearing the plan from the development team. We had heard kind of the generic, coming soon, we have plans, we can't wait to let you know, and like that's fair. But it's also fair for some people to be frustrated of, yes, that can be kind of viewed as corporate speak. We want to hear more. We want to see more. So we were all kind of waiting to hear like, all right, we'll wait. Let's hear your plan. And we've heard the plan. And honestly, that was all I could have ever hoped for and more from the team. Not just laying out like, this is our plan, how we're going to go from where we are now to the future. And this is our plan moving forward. And we have a regular kind of predictable cadence for patches, which is even better now, because before we were just kind of saying hopefully there's a patch coming at some point in August. Now it's I know to expect some sort of patch on Tuesday-ish, give or take. Is every patch going to be this gigantic patch that changes the game and adds 10 new systems and does all these things? Of course not. But just knowing that there's something coming weekly gives you that kind of grounding that you can set of, okay, let's see what's coming next Tuesday, or let's see what they speak about for the Tuesday coming up. So having that is really, really cool. Additionally, there's a couple different levels to that as well. Obviously, we just recently hit open beta. There's still some, client issues, server issues, bugs in the cards, things like that. All of the things that you kind of expect to have in a beta type situation. But now knowing that we have weekly patches coming out, you can expect that on a weekly basis, you're going to see the game improving week over week. We're going to see some more bugs fixes week over week. I can say for sure, after the August 4th patch, in terms of general client performance and stability, I've noticed the client taking up more or less resources on my computer. Animations and timing of things has been more smooth, more snappy. So that's a good improvement. We are still seeing a fair amount of, sometimes slowness in what I assume is on the server side. But knowing that we have these bug fixes coming on a frequent basis every week at the worst, you can really start to see the improvements and the benefits start to stack up quite a bit in the client as a whole, and that's a really good thing to see coming. Another thing that was announced would be that balance changes will be included in these weekly patches. And that is not to say necessarily that every single week will have balance changes, but the fact that these weekly patches have the ability to include balance patches in them gives me a lot of hope for being kind of nimble when it comes to changes. And what I mean by that is typically there's two main schools of thought when it comes to balance. There is the slow, deliberate, careful approach, and that is the better approach, in my opinion, for bigger changes or reworks or things like that. And those ones happen, every couple months. That used to be like Hearthstone's old balance philosophy was you would wait like entire expansions before seeing balance changes come out unless there was a card in particular that was like actually broken, like causing bug states in the game or things like that. Or like the most tier 0 of tier 0 decks. Other than that, they kind of just let things sit for a while. They've gotten better in recent memory, but that was kind of the old Hearthstone philosophy. It's also a philosophy I think we see a good amount in Marvel Snap. Despite having weekly OTA patches, you'll frequently see the OTAs addressing cards and decks from multiple months ago. So while you get, weekly changes, the changes are addressing things that are months old already. You don't typically see something be pretty quickly touched. So despite having the weekly cadence in Snap, you still have the kind of slower, let's wait a few months before doing anything type of philosophy. One philosophy that I'm hoping to see in Dual Force is frequent small changes versus bigger, slower ones. And what I mean by that is if there is a card or a deck or a specific archetype or, a series of cards that is overperforming, you can definitely collect data on the deck as a whole over the course of a few months. But if something's like initially out of the gate just far and away better than everything, or even if it's not far and away better in terms of core metrics, but if there's been a particular deck that has just been top of the meta for too long or, is polarizing things a bit too much, I'd rather them make frequent small changes that you can kind of hone in on the perfect balance state versus slower big ones. So like if there's a card, I'm not even going to, put out a hypothetical stat line or an ability, but if there's a new card that comes out and it's way too good too quickly, rather than wait 3 months and then kill the card in 3 months, let's take a point of attack off here, take a point of health off here, make these minor changes, and if it winds up being too quickly, next week just undo the change or give a little bit back. But like, I'd rather see them tweaking a tiny bit here and there every week, and then eventually and quickly hone in on this is the ideal balance state, we hit that quickly, versus if they wait 3 months and they make one bigger change, you either outright kill the card, which you don't want to do, or you don't make enough of a change, and now we've waited 3 months, and you still didn't actually address the problem enough, and it's still a problem, and then we have to hope that maybe you're willing to make some frequent changes in the follow-up patches. Especially while we're in beta, I am of the opinion that while you're in beta, you should be kind of iterating on everything. So if there's cards that you want to have that don't see play that you want to see get some more play, make some small tweaks to them. If you overdo it and one of them gets too good, worst case scenario, the player base has to wait a week, and then you can just bring it back down in the next patch week. But I'm hoping to see that balanced philosophy as a whole, but even more so during this beta period. Tweak things, get everything to where you want them to be before full release. You have this ability to roll out these weekly patches, leverage them in my opinion. And finally, the other thing that we have to look forward to is the more frequent comic release schedule. I think now the team is kind of in a spot where they're ready to start rolling out these comics more often. And once the subscription is fully released, I believe we have weekly comics to look forward to. And we'll spend some time later in the episode talking about this week's most recent comic. So this is your spoiler alert in advance, in case you haven't played through it yet and you don't want it spoiled, but we will talk about it at some point. But just knowing that we have that kind of constant stream of PvE content coming in, it's just something good to look forward to. I thoroughly enjoy the comics. I think they bring a lot of additional fun to the game, especially for players who aren't necessarily the biggest PvP players. who maybe just like the gameplay of Dual Force in general, or like the DC IP and want some more things like that. And just the comics allow unique new ways to play the game that you might not necessarily be able to do in a PvP setting because, it might be too OP, or, it might not be fair balance, or, awkward game states. In a PvE scenario, you can introduce these kinds of power fantasies that people playing a superhero game are going to want. So they can, craft an encounter where Superman is just ridiculously OP for an encounter, and you can give him some awesome ability, and it's fine because it's PvE. I'm excited to see all the different directions they can take that. There's just so much more opportunity where being overpowered is okay and encouraged in a PvE setting that I think it leans perfectly into this kind of superhero dynamic of Dual Force that it's really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with that. So kind of segueing into a topic that I wanted to revisit from last episode. Last episode, we talked a lot about tempo. We talked about board clears, and we talked about how board clears play into the aspect of tempo and trying to come back on the board in Dual Force as a whole. And then after that, we had some balance changes, which came out. And if you are not aware or you need a refresher, the two major ones, or a couple major ones, I guess. This one's not a board clear, but Energy Blast went from 3 damage to 4 damage. That is the bronze action and energy. Culling, the Tyranny silver board clear, went from destroying all recruits with 3 attack or less to all recruits with 4 attack or less. And then Hellblaze, the gold action and energy, went from 3 damage to all enemies to 4 damage to all enemies. And after testing some of those buffs over the last week, or, maybe a little bit over a week since we got those changes, it's been 6 days, so it's been about a week. I have to say that those tweaks to board clears and, to a lesser extent, Energy Blast, but the tweaks to the board clears as a whole, I think have actually done quite a bit in terms of addressing some of that tempo problem that I talked about in the last episode. Over 2 separate sessions, I spent a lot of time testing the new culling because, as we said last time, culling was kind of the only board clear that felt okay as of last patch. So now, culling going from 3 attack to 4 attack, if it already felt okay, it probably feels really, really good nowadays. And I can say after a lot of testing, it does feel very strong. To the point now where if I'm playing against like a Batman Wonder Woman deck, or, a couple of other either might-based decks, or sometimes inmates, although if they get their Black Mask going, it doesn't matter. But in general, if I'm playing a slower deck, a lot of the times you can kind of just hard mulligan looking for culling, because culling is now good enough where if you fall behind on the board, culling can make up that tempo if you have it ready for turn 3 ideally, but turn 3 or turn 4. So culling is really hitting that exact kind of slot that you were expecting that we talked about from last episode, where you need your board clears to generate enough tempo, recover enough tempo where you don't just lose the game at that point. And culling was already doing a pretty solid job of it, and now I think it's doing a very good job of it as well. So that's been really awesome to see and really awesome in testing. And furthermore, the 2 energy changes to Energy Blast and to Hellblaze, I have recently been testing those in a bunch of Shazam decks, and they both are feeling very strong as well. Not just from... because previously when you saw things like Hellblaze, it was being used in more of like almost like a burn type of setting, where they were using it in a more aggressive strategy, pairing it with things like Earthquake, just trying to deal damage to the opposing leaders while clearing their board as well. And it was already doing an okay job at that. But now I have to say, the break point of 4 damage for Hellblaze feels a lot more strong. And same thing with Energy Blast. Let's cover Energy Blast first, I guess. Energy Blast before was always a very good bronze card in the bronze turns. And what I mean by that was, having Energy Blast in your opening hand on turn 1, the bronze turn, or turn 2, the bronze turn, and even kind of into turn 3, the silver bronze turn, you were always kind of happy to have Energy Blast. It killed Black Mask, it killed early Clark Kent, it killed Clayface, it killed most of the things that you're going to see early if you're playing against an energy deck. It could kill Stargirl. Energy Blast was kind of your utility turn 1 play, or first couple turn plays, to answer a lot of the most common snowbally things in the meta. The problem with Energy Blast is that it didn't really scale that well into the mid to late game. Now, you may say one additional damage doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference, but I think that 4 damage breakpoint is very important in that kind of mid-game scenario. There's a good amount of silver cards that have 4 or less health that Energy Blast now does a very good job at cleaning up. And just in general, 4 health is just a good kind of cleanup card as well. So if it wasn't something that flat out took out a card, that 4 damage would often be like, a lot of bronze recruits, for example, have 2 attack. So if you're trading into a silver or a gold that has 6 health, that bronze takes away 2, brings it down to 4, and then that 4 breakpoint becomes a lot more important, and Energy Blast can take out something that it otherwise did not before. And that's not to kind of disregard the fact that Energy Blast can go face. So you can hit a leader in the face, which now means you have a 4 damage to any leader of your choosing for a bronze, which is extra good for aggressive strategies. It makes it a lot better as a mid to late game top deck if you're trying to close the game out, and just makes it a very solid utility card for energy as a whole. And then following up on that, Hellblaze now feels very solid, because the biggest thing with Hellblaze before was it dealt 3 damage to both leaders, which was, decent, and then 3 damage to all recruits, all enemy recruits, that is. But on your gold turn, 3 damage doesn't necessarily clean up everything, and the damage it deals to leaders, if you were trying to use it for that, Living Lightning just does that better. Living Lightning is the gold energy card that does 5 damage to 2 enemies, and you get to select those 2 targets. So if you want to just damage to the leaders, Living Lightning does that better. But now, Hellblaze being 4 damage to everything, it really makes it a much more cognizant decision you have to make between choosing Living Lightning or Hellblaze. And I think in a lot of scenarios now, Hellblaze might actually be better, because just like I said with the 4 damage on Energy Blast, the 4 damage on Hellblaze now means you're much more likely to clean up a lot of the opposing recruits, so you have that going for you, so you can deal damage to the opposing leaders while also wiping their board and getting that tempo advantage of clearing their board and still pushing face damage. Hellblaze went from a card that I never really put a lot of thought into including in my deck. I had tested it before, but it never felt, it felt okay at best a lot of the times. And then now, kind of testing it out, it feels a lot better, and it feels kind of what you want a board clear to be. Solid damage, high likelihood that if it doesn't clear the board entirely, it clears most of the board, and then you have the added benefit of pushing that damage to both leaders' faces so that you can kind of start pushing towards closing the game as a control deck. Now, all of that is to say that, Aura is still a problem for all of these cards, but a lot of the cards that you need to get rid of, especially as you're entering those mid-game turns, or if you're playing against inmates, getting into your gold turn if you manage to survive that long, or just aggressive decks in general, Hellblaze clears a lot of the things that you need it to clear. Against an opposing control deck, it may not necessarily be the best in that scenario, and that's where you probably need to lean more on the strength of your recruits or some of your other removal cards. If you're pairing it with like Bigger They Are, or things like that, or Hammer Throw to take out some bigger targets. But I think the AoE in general is doing its job a lot better than it used to. And now the fact that Hellblaze feels better has now led me to playing some more slightly slower energy decks, which then makes me feel a little bit better about playing Earthquake. And now you kind of have enough AoE to deal with a lot of the more aggressive strategies that you're seeing in the game right now. And I think it's feeling really solid. And I think, obviously, it was a complete coincidence that we had an entire section talking about board clears and like the damage-based removal, and then like a day or two later, we had a patch buffing most of it. Complete coincidence, but I just felt like it was worth revisiting that topic now through the lens of those most recent balance changes, talking a bit about some of my own experience testing these balance changes. I definitely would love to hear from you all about your experience with these recent balance changes. If you found yourself having a more easy time regaining tempo, if you're testing some of these cards out or seeing how they work in some of your decks, I think it was definitely a step in the right direction by the development team, kind of allowing some of those early snowballs to be answered a bit better, so that now if you're running a deck that runs those AoE and you're playing against a like an inmate deck, you now have an out where you don't just concede on turn 2 because your opponent played a black mask. Now you know, as long as I have that culling ready for turn 3, I probably can get out of this situation. Now, obviously, we still have to draw those cards, but at least now there are answers that don't just leave you empty on board. You can wipe their board and follow up with something. So that's very awesome to see. Final topic I had for today, I just wanted to talk about the most recent comic that came out, the Justice League Part 2. Again, spoiler alert, if you're the kind of person that does not want to know about the encounters and things like that before you play them yourself, this would be your time to, I guess, pause the podcast and come back to it after you've had a chance to play the comic. We're not going to talk about every single encounter, but I just want to put out that spoiler alert just in case. Overall, I would say this comic was very nice. Some of the things that I liked about it, this is only the second comic we have in the game, so you didn't want them to kind of change things up too much, and the reason for that is this is a new game. We have a lot of new players joining and testing out the game every day. At least initially, I think comics should be familiar, somewhat predictable in terms of their format. You're going to have, a puzzle, a couple encounters. You'll get some buffs from the puzzles. I think having that sort of predictability, at least in the short term, is a good thing for new players joining the game. So that was the first thing I liked, was as somebody who played the first comic, playing the second one, it felt familiar, but it felt different. It didn't feel like you were doing the exact same thing as the first comic, but it kind of followed a lot of that formula that you were expecting to see, and they made enough changes on that formula where it still felt new. On top of that, I think they really started to experiment a little bit with how some of the encounters can go. So, for example, I think one of the things that stood out to me the most was the Flash encounter versus Darkseid, running away from the Omega Beams. They introduced an alternate win condition where you had to generate a third resource and upgrade all 3 of your resources to gold. I thought that was very interesting and an awesome use of a PvE mechanic. You can introduce these alternate win conditions, and kind of a lot of the special cards that they included for Flash in that mode, like the discard your hand and skip a turn, the draw an extra card at the start of your turns from now on. I think it was called I Gotta Go Fast or something. I think they did an excellent job of introducing these PvE only, at least right now, maybe they introduce them in the future, but they introduced these PvE only cards that really encompassed, in my opinion, what it would feel like to be the Flash in that encounter. So they kind of encompassed that really well, to where that Flash encounter really felt like you were playing as the Flash, and then you had the added bonus on top of it of this alternative win condition, which really made that like a very unique and awesome encounter. And to me, that stood out as the developers kind of teasing / testing of what can we do in this PvE space? What kind of things can we try out? What kind of new things can we do that you can't really do in PvP? And being able to kind of nail the feeling of the Flash that well, as well as make it just a really unique and new and different encounter, I think was a really awesome step and a awesome development in terms of seeing what we can expect from comics moving forward. Another thing that I really enjoyed that I'd love for them to explore more and more was the idea of a multi-stage encounter. Now, was the difficulty of this comic very high? No, and we'll talk about that more in a bit, more in a little bit. But the Darkseid encounter being, 4 phases? You started with Aquaman, Green Lantern, I think, and then you moved on to Flash, and then you moved on to Wonder Woman and something else. But basically, this fight against Darkseid was like 4 different encounters. Each encounter took a little bit of a different twist. His abilities changed. Your leaders changed. The idea of that kind of multi-stage encounters where you have to whittle down this big bad in different ways with different scenarios, utilizing your different leaders, I think that was really, really cool. And I definitely would want to see more of that, especially as we address some more of the kind of major villains in DC moving forward. I would love to see more of these multi-stage fights where we have to kind of whittle it down, because then, like, if you think about like your Darkseid level fights, or for Marvel, like your Thanos level fights, or Galactus level fights, or any of these kind of major big, like, gigantic villains, if you just fight them in one fight, like let's say Darkseid was a normal leader, he had 25 health, you had your 2 leaders, and you just took Darkseid from 25 health down to 0, kind of feels anticlimactic. This character is supposed to be this major, like, force that it takes a team of superheroes to take out. Beating him in one encounter where he has a normal health total just kind of feels flat. So leveraging these kind of multi-stage encounters, I think, is a great way to encompass kind of the gravity, the largeness, the power of some of the villains that you'll be fighting over the course of these comics. So I'm definitely looking forward to that as well moving forward. 2 more things that I really liked about the comic. The first was that kind of final encounter where, while I personally didn't really lose any leaders, I think I lost 1, but they had kind of that last stand type of scenario where the entire Justice League came together, and anytime you lost a leader, you'd be able to backfill that leader with another member of the Justice League. I assume if you lost all of your leaders, you would lose, but it kind of really represented that kind of last stand, heroes standing against evil that you see in a lot of movies and comics, where despite Dual Force being a game where you play with 2 leaders, they were able to fit the entire Justice League into that fight if you needed them. And it was awesome kind of having that feeling of, all right, we lost Batman, now I get to call in the Flash as backup or something like that. That was really, really cool, and I think that was really well done. And then, additionally, this was, I think, the first encounter after the puzzle. I like that they are experimenting with non-standard leaders in puzzles. And that's not just your Darkseid opponent. That first encounter with Cyborg, you have Silas Stone as a leader. And not only was that pretty cool, since you kind of got to play with a character that you might not have otherwise gotten to play with in the game. You're like, Silas is a recruit in the game, but there's nothing to ever say that an actual Silas leader would come to pass. But just like I had mentioned with the Flash scenario, where the developers were able to kind of introduce this kind of gameplay that only works in this kind of PvE setting, they can do similar things when it comes to leaders. So whether that's completely new leaders like we saw with Silas Stone in this comic number 2, or just messing around with the power fantasy of the current slate of leaders, or, testing ideas. So like if they just want to give you a super powerful, Superman leader that has a 2 charge, gain 20 attack, they can do that in PvE. But also they can use it as a means of exploring and experimenting with abilities for future leaders. So if they have an idea of whomever, like let's say they want to add, a Nightwing leader one day. And they have this idea for an ability, but they don't necessarily know if they want to release it like that. Internal testing's been inconclusive. They can put that leader ability onto a PvE scenario and see how players respond to it. and you can kind of sift through that data. Like, obviously, you need to be able to discern whether do the players think this is a cool ability in a PvE setting, or is this something that they'd want to see in PvP, and does this work in PvP? It's a way for them to start testing, experimenting, tweaking, and really fulfilling that power fantasy when it comes to the kinds of things that we are all looking for in this game. So that was really, really cool. Now, I'd be remiss, and I don't want to ever be the kind of person that... I think I'm a pretty positive person in general, but I do want to always kind of speak about the entire, like, tell things how they are. So the comics are not perfect yet. It's only the second comic. I don't expect them to be. But I did want to kind of share the biggest opportunities for improvement that I see so far. The first one I will put in the puzzle category. So we've seen in the first two comics the puzzles where you have to move the glyphs around, do different things with the glyphs, and once you get all the blue glyphs on your side, you win. And that is a perfectly fine puzzle. I have no beef with that puzzle whatsoever. It's pretty cool. It's something that they should probably keep in their tool belt. But I definitely would like to see, as time goes on and more comics come out, that they experiment more with what puzzles can be. Whether that's taking the glyph idea and expanding on it, maybe giving us kind of pre-planned puzzle scenarios of gameplay. So we're at a particular board state, they give you a static set of cards, so like you always have the same 5 cards in your hand and the same 3 cards on board, and they give you, you have the prompt, survive until next turn. So you have to, find the correct sequence of cards, correct interactions between cards, find the correct things to trade into to survive the round. Or they could do the same thing of give you a set of cards and you have to kill your opponent this turn. Like, defeat your opponent's leader this turn. And you have to find the right sequence of cards to play out in order to achieve those objectives. That's just an example. Elder Scrolls Legends had a pretty solid puzzle mode. I think Hearthstone has a puzzle mode as well. So I definitely would like to see them continue to build upon the puzzles that we receive in comics. Again, no shot against the glyph puzzles. They're perfectly fine, but I would love to see them continue experimenting and messing around with different kinds of puzzles moving forward. And then the other biggest avenue that I see for improvement, and this is more of a long-term improvement, I don't think it's worth the development effort in the short term, is I would like to see them at some point come back and revisit old comics and add a higher difficulty mode for a new set of rewards. Whether that is, I think a perfectly reasonable thing to do would be go to each comic. So far we've had 2 comics and we've received 2 cosmetics, 1 player icon, and 1 card back. So let's say, 6 months, a year plus from now, they come back and they add a hard mode to these 2 current comics. And for completing those, you get 2,000 dual coins and then maybe a premium version of the Dark Side player icon or an animated version of the Dark Side card back. Because when I play through these comics, I enjoy them a lot. But the type of player I am, the biggest craving I'm having is I wish this was a little bit harder. And I don't think they should make the base version more difficult. I think comics should be accessible to players of all skill levels, brand new players, experienced players, good players, bad players, everything in between. I don't think you want to make comics difficult to complete because they're just supposed to be something fun, a new way to kind of expand on the DC Dual Force universe, and a good way to get some rewards into players' hands with, I don't want to say minimal effort, but, not needing to try too hard. It should just be mostly an enjoyable experience. However, the developers are going to go through all this effort to make all of these comics. I think with only a moderate amount of extra work, they could revisit those comics and increase the replayability by giving us additional difficulty modes on those comics in the future. So that is definitely something that I would love to see them add at some point down the road as a way of making these comics kind of like evergreen content. I know there's only so much you can get out of a singular comic, but if you just add hard mode to all of the comics a year from now, once we have, let's say, 25, 35, 45 comics, that's a whole 45 set of comics you can come back through. And I don't expect them to do it all at once, but, do a couple at a time monthly and, you're just kind of increasing the way players can interact with your game and increasing the kind of playable amount of PvE content, which I think is something you should definitely be targeting and adding and hoping to do. So yeah, I'm definitely hoping to see that. I think those are the two biggest avenues for improvement to comics right now, in my opinion. As a whole, I'm really, really happy with even just the small improvements I've seen from Comic 1 to Comic 2, the kind of how they've continued fleshing out what they're capable of doing in comics, and I'm really excited to see what they do with comics in the future. So that's all I've got for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for DC Dual Force Podcast Episode 3. If you guys have any questions you'd like to see answered in the next episode, drop them in however you can contact me, comment section on YouTube, tweet at me on Twitter or X or whatever it's called nowadays, Discord, however you'd like to contact me. I'd like to start mixing in a question and answer session for you guys. Have that be a dedicated segment. Like I've mentioned, eventually I want to have this podcast actually be recorded live weekly on Twitch so that we can have a live Q&A section. But we'll get there eventually, and we'll start having some guests coming soon. But that's all I got for now. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you guys for next week's episode.